They said memory softens things with time. They lied. It was still wet when I found it, the thin white stick wedged between the registration papers and a half-empty pack of mints in the glove compartment of my husband's car. A pregnancy test. The blue line sharp and unmistakable, a tiny flag of humiliation waving in the stale air of a vehicle I had vacuumed myself the day before. I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I did, instantly and completely. I am 72 years old. My husband, Richard, is 68. We have been married for 46 years, long enough for the rhythms of his breathing to match the turns of my thoughts, or so I believed. I used to think betrayal came with shouting, with lipstick stains or furtive phone calls. I didn't expect it to come in the form of a small plastic wand left behind like a confession, too lazy to be hidden. That morning had begun with such ordinary quiet that the universe almost felt like it was setting a trap. I had gone into his car to look for the envelope with the insurance papers. He had driven to his golf club earlier, called from the road to say he'd forgotten them in the glove compartment. Could I please check? The request had sounded casual, the kind of thing we did for each other out of habit. I remember the smell of dust and leather, the faint trace of his aftershave, the way sunlight slanted through the windshield and turned the dashboard into a line of glare. When I reached for the envelope, my hand brushed against the smooth plastic surface, and before I even pulled it out, I knew it wasn't a pen or a receipt. It was something alive with implication, something that changed the temperature of the air. I carried it into the house as if it were an artifact from another world. The kitchen clock ticked its indifferent rhythm, the refrigerator hummed, the morning news muttered from the television about traffic and inflation, and none of it mattered. I placed the test on the counter beside the coffee maker and sat down. I did not cry, not then. I simply looked at the thing that did not belong in the life I thought I had built, and a strange calm spread through me, like the quiet that comes after a storm has already decided which trees to break. For a long while, I watched the blue line. It did not fade. It only grew clearer as the minutes passed, as if mocking the steady breathing of the house around it. When Richard came home 2 hours later, whistling lightly, tossing his keys into the bowl by the door, I was still sitting there. He looked at me, then at the counter, then back at me again. "What's that?" he asked, and for a second I believed he might be joking, that we would laugh together at the absurdity of it. But his face remained untroubled, perfectly smooth, the face of a man who has practiced not being surprised. "You tell me," I said. My voice sounded unfamiliar to my own ears, steady but far away, like it was being transmitted from another version of me who hadn't yet learned disappointment. He blinked once, shrugged slightly, said, "Probably something from work. Maybe Emily's daughter." Emily was his assistant, 42, divorced, brittle-voiced, the kind of woman who wore too much perfume and too little patience. "She was in the car last week. Dropped some files. You know how she is." He smiled then, a small upward curl of lips that was supposed to disarm me. I didn't answer. I watched the way he moved toward the fridge, poured himself a glass of water, as though the universe hadn't just tilted. "You believe me, don't you?" he said after a moment, still facing the window, his back to me. The light caught the thin silver line of his hair, the one I used to trace with my fingers at night. I thought of the decades that had stretched behind us, our first apartment with the leaky ceiling, the nights we stayed up feeding our son, the funerals, the Christmases, the long silences that were supposed to mean comfort. I thought of all the times I had chosen to believe him, because love, I once told myself, was an act of faith, not evidence. "Sure," I said finally. He turned and smiled, relieved, kissed my forehead lightly, and went upstairs, humming. That was when I realized the sound of his humming made me nauseous. I sat for a long time after he left the room, tracing the rim of my coffee mug with my finger, feeling the tremor under my skin. I tried to summon the old excuses. He's tired. He's distracted. Men are clumsy with secrets. But the excuses felt thin, like worn fabric. What struck me hardest wasn't the possibility of infidelity. It was the certainty that he didn't care whether I found out. That indifference was colder than any affair could be. It meant I had become invisible not by accident, but by design. When I finally stood up, the pregnancy test still sat on the counter, silent and smug. I wrapped it in a paper towel and placed it in the drawer with the batteries and old pens, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I needed to know where it was. It had become evidence, not of what he had done, but of who we had become. That night, as we sat through dinner, roasted chicken, salad with too much dressing, he told me about a new project at work, a younger team he was mentoring. His eyes lit up as he spoke the word younger. I nodded at the right times, smiled faintly, even asked a question. Years of marriage had trained me well. Performance was a second language. But inside, something small and sharp had begun to turn. Later, in bed, he reached for my hand. I let him. Habit is stronger than rage at first. His fingers were cool, familiar. He fell asleep quickly, the steady snore of a man confident in his own righteousness. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting as headlights passed outside. My mind replayed his face when he saw the test, not the guilt or fear I might have expected, but mild annoyance, as if I had inconvenienced him by noticing. I thought of all the things I had forgiven quietly over the years, his absences, his little cruelties disguised as jokes, the way he introduced me as the Mrs. instead of by my name. I had mistaken endurance for love. Now I saw it for what it was, a slow erasure I had helped him perform. When dawn came, I rose before him, walked to the window, and watched the light seep into the garden. The hydrangeas I planted 40 years ago still bloomed, though paler now, their petals thin as paper. I used to think they survived because I tended them. Now I knew they survived because they refused to die, no matter how neglected. I opened the drawer, looked once more at the wrapped test, and whispered, almost to myself, "You should have thrown it away properly, Richard." Then I smiled, a small, dangerous smile that even I didn't recognize. Something had ended in that moment, something quiet and essential, and though I didn't yet know it, the woman I had been all those years was already gone. When I confronted him the second time, it wasn't planned, and it wasn't angry either. I had spent 3 days convincing myself that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that there was some reasonable explanation that would reappear if I stayed quiet long enough. But silence didn't bring peace. It brought noise, the kind that lived under the skin. I waited until Sunday afternoon, after church, after he'd mowed the lawn and showered and changed into one of his neat polo shirts. He sat at the table reading the paper, the sunlight sliding across his glasses, and I remember thinking how ordinary he looked, how thoroughly practiced he was at appearing harmless. I said his name once, softly. He looked up, and I placed the photograph I had printed from the clinic's website in front of him. It was a picture of the building he'd visited the week before, the one where I'd seen his car in the parking lot when I drove past by accident, or so I'd told myself. His eyes flicked down, then up again, and there it was. The faintest tightening of the jaw, so slight it could have been mistaken for a tic. But I saw it because I had lived long enough with that face to know every shift of its surface. He set the paper aside carefully, folded it once, and asked, "Why were you looking for me there?" Not what I was implying, not how I could think such a thing, just why I was where he hadn't expected me. It wasn't guilt in his tone, it was irritation, as though I'd stepped into a room where I didn't belong. I told him I wasn't looking for him. I told him I had an appointment with my optometrist nearby and recognized his car. I told him the truth and the lie in the same breath, and both felt equally hollow. He laughed then, a soft, dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You really think I'm stupid enough to get involved in something like that?" he said. "You think I'd risk everything we have?" The word we landed heavy, too deliberate, as though he'd rehearsed it. I asked him, "Then whose is it?" Meaning the test, the visits, the quiet shift in his eyes. But he pretended not to hear, took a sip of his water, leaned back in the chair like a man preparing to endure a tedious conversation. "You've always had a vivid imagination," he said, and his tone changed then, gentle, condescending, almost paternal. "I think sometimes you work yourself up because you've got too much time to think. You're retired, you don't get out enough. Maybe it's the medication." It was all so perfectly crafted, the subtle turn that transformed his dishonesty into my instability. That was his gift, really. He could twist a moment until you doubted your own eyes. I remember staring at the veins on his hands, blue and pulsing, the same hands that used to fix the garden gate and butter my toast. The same hands that once, long ago, trembled when he held our newborn son. I wondered if they trembled now for someone else, or if they had learned steadiness from deceit. I said quietly, "Richard, I'm not confused. I found the test. I saw you at the clinic." His face didn't change, not really, but something behind it went dark, like a curtain being drawn. He sighed, long and theatrical, and said, "You always do this. You take something small and make it into an opera. It's exhausting." For a moment I thought he might confess, not out of remorse but out of arrogance, the way some people confess just to watch your reaction. Instead, he stood up, collected his plate from the table though he hadn't eaten, and said, "I'm going for a drive. You should rest. Maybe call your sister. You sound unwell." Then he left, and I listened to the sound of the car reversing, the tires crunching over the gravel, the slow fade of the engine until all that was left was the ticking of the kitchen clock. I sat there a long time, my fingers pressed to the photograph of the clinic, feeling the faint texture of the paper against my skin, and I realized I wasn't shocked anymore. Shock is brief. This was something else, something heavier, almost physical, like the weight of another person sitting on my chest. That night, I couldn't eat. I made soup, stirred it out of habit, but when I brought the spoon to my lips, it tasted of metal. I poured it down the sink and watched the water swirl it away, wondering how many other things in my life had disappeared just like that, silently, efficiently, without protest. I used to believe that betrayal was a rupture, sudden and dramatic, but it's not. It's erosion. It happens grain by grain until one day you look down and realize the ground beneath you has been replaced by air. He came home late, smelling faintly of mint and perfume. He said he'd gone for a drive along the coast, needed some space to clear his head. He kissed my cheek, his lips cold, and went straight upstairs. I stood in the hallway, staring at the indentation of his shoes on the rug. There was no anger in me, not yet, just an eerie clarity. I began to notice things I had ignored for years. The new aftershave, the way he always kept his phone face down, the small smile he carried when he thought no one was watching. It wasn't guilt. It was satisfaction. He had been living a double life for so long, it had stopped feeling like deceit to him. It was simply the way things were. The next morning, he behaved as though nothing had happened. He made coffee, asked about the neighbor's cat, reminded me to take my vitamins. I watched him move through the kitchen, his body so familiar, it felt like a map of my own. He looked up, caught me staring, and said lightly, "Don't worry, sweetheart. You're safe with me." The words struck me as strange, almost absurd, like a line from a bad play. Safe from what? From whom? From the truth? When he left for work, I sat at the table again and tried to remember the last time he had looked at me as though I were still someone he could hurt. I couldn't. He didn't even need to lie convincingly anymore. My disbelief no longer mattered to him. Later that day, I called our son, just to hear a voice that didn't belong to Richard. We spoke briefly about his children, their school, his job. I almost told him, almost let the words fall out. But something stopped me. Maybe pride? Maybe the knowledge that he would try to fix it, to rationalize it, to protect his father. So I said nothing. When I hung up, I realized I had just taken my first step into secrecy of my own. That was new. That was power. The following days blurred. Richard grew cheerful again, like a man who had successfully closed a difficult deal. He brought me flowers, daisies from the supermarket, the kind that come pre-arranged and smell faintly of plastic. He asked if I wanted to go away for the weekend. I said no. I told him I wanted to stay home, tend to the garden, read. He shrugged, said, "Suit yourself." When he drove off Saturday morning, golf bag in the back seat, I watched from the window until his car disappeared down the street. Then I went to his study. I hadn't been in there for years. It was his domain, his kingdom of order and pretense. The drawers opened easily. He never imagined I'd look. Inside, I found what I both expected and dreaded: a second phone, carefully tucked beneath old receipts. I turned it on, and the screen lit up instantly, no password, as if arrogance itself were security. The messages were brief, efficient, intimate in their carelessness. "Can't wait to see you. Don't forget to bring the vitamins." Another. "Call me after she's asleep." She. That was me. I stood there with the phone in my hand, my reflection caught in the dark window glass. I looked older than I remembered, but not weak. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it. There was no satisfaction in discovery, only the sharp awareness that my marriage had already ended. It just hadn't been announced. When he came home that evening, cheerful and sunburned, I poured him a drink, listened to him talk about the weather, and thought of how absurd it was that life could continue in the same rooms after the truth had been exposed. The walls didn't collapse. The dishes didn't break. Only I did. Quietly. Invisibly. Like a thread snapping beneath fabric. That night, when he reached for me in bed, I turned away and said I was tired. He murmured something about how distant I'd been lately. I almost laughed. Distance had become our only language. He fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady, his arm heavy across my hip. The weight of a man who still believed he was entitled to my sleep. I stared into the darkness and thought of the test, the clinic, the messages. I realized then that the worst part wasn't that he'd betrayed me. It was that he no longer saw me as someone worth lying to properly. I had become furniture, reliable and silent. And in that realization, something inside me began to move, slow but deliberate, like a tide that had been waiting years to turn. It's strange how quickly humiliation becomes routine. Within a week, the shock had cooled into something quieter, a dull, metallic ache that lived somewhere behind my ribs. Richard carried on exactly as before, as if the conversation about the pregnancy test, the photograph, the phone had never happened. I used to think silence was a kind of mercy, but now I understood it as strategy. Every time I tried to reopen the subject, he would smile faintly, touch my wrist, and say, "Let's not start that again." He had mastered the art of dismissal so subtle it almost felt polite. I found myself watching him move through the house like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. My welcome. He hummed while shaving, took long showers, left wet towels on the bed. I counted each gesture like proof of something, though I couldn't have said what exactly I was proving anymore. He started going out more often. At first he claimed it was work, some late meetings, a networking dinner, but I knew better. It wasn't the hours that betrayed him. It was the expression he wore when he came home. There was a certain lightness to him, an absent-minded cheerfulness that I hadn't seen in years, the kind of buoyancy a man acquires only when he feels admired. He smelled faintly of some floral perfume that didn't belong to me, and his clothes carried traces of another environment, a sharper air, maybe an apartment near the water or a small hotel. I didn't ask. Not because I was afraid of the answer, but because the questions had become meaningless. When someone decides to erase you, the act is complete the moment you notice. Everything that follows is just maintenance. I began to notice smaller changes, almost domestic betrayals. He bought a new bottle of cologne, the same brand he'd worn when we first met, as if trying to rewind himself to a version he preferred. He started dyeing his hair, subtly, not enough for others to notice, but I saw the faint, unnatural warmth at the roots. He went to the gym more often, wore fitted shirts that accentuated his shoulders. He didn't do any of this for me, and that knowledge was both humiliating and liberating. There is a particular cruelty in watching a man reinvent himself while you stand still, holding the life you built together, like evidence in a trial you didn't agree to attend. Friends stopped calling as much. Some of them because they sensed something uneasy between us. Others because Richard had quietly redrawn the boundaries of our social world. He hosted dinners for colleagues and their wives, and when I joined, he treated me like a visiting aunt, gently patronized, politely ignored. Once at a party, I overheard him tell someone, "My wife doesn't really keep up with these things anymore. She's more of a homebody." The phrase landed like a verdict. I wanted to interrupt, to remind him that I had once been the woman who organized his fundraisers, typed his reports, proofread his speeches, who had paid half of his graduate tuition with money from the clinic where I worked double shifts. Instead, I smiled, excused myself, and went to the bathroom to sit on the edge of the tub until my breathing slowed. In the mirror, my reflection looked both familiar and foreign. I tried to remember the last time I had bought something new just for myself and couldn't. At home, small rituals began to dissolve. We no longer watched television together after dinner. He would retreat to his study with a glass of whiskey, and I would sit in the living room pretending to read. Some nights I could hear him speaking softly on the phone. The tone was unmistakable, a blend of amusement and tenderness he had long since stopped reserving for me. I'd lie awake later, listening to the rhythm of his sleep. steady, and guiltless. He had once told me, years ago, that his father taught him never to let a woman see you afraid. I suppose he had learned that lesson too well. There were moments when I almost convinced myself that none of it mattered, that age had dulled the edges of fidelity, that perhaps this was simply how marriages evolved, a quiet agreement to look away. But then I would catch sight of something small, a text that flashed briefly on his phone, a faint lipstick stain on a coffee cup, and the air around me would tighten again. Once, while folding laundry, I found a receipt for a boutique lingerie store tucked into his trouser pocket. I laughed when I saw it, a dry, humorless laugh that startled even me. It wasn't the betrayal itself that cut the deepest. It was the pettiness of the deception, the laziness of it. After 46 years together, he hadn't even bothered to hide his evidence properly. I started keeping notes, not because I planned to confront him again, but because I needed proof for myself that I wasn't inventing it. A small notebook I kept in the drawer beside my bed, each line a date, a detail, a faint echo of a life unraveling. Tuesday, late again, shirt smells of jasmine. Friday, called me Margaret by accident. Sunday, left his phone unlocked, text from E, next time, your place. Writing it down steadied me. It made the chaos legible. Some nights I would open the notebook just to read the entries, to remind myself that I wasn't losing my mind, that this erosion had a pattern, that it could be measured. He must have sensed my withdrawal, because he began to talk more, a strange flood of empty chatter about sports, politics, the price of gas. He'd ask about my day, feigning interest, his voice slightly too bright. I recognized the technique. It was the same one I had used years earlier with our son, when I knew he was lying about his grades. I played along, offered polite answers, watched him over the rim of my glass, and wondered if he knew how transparent he'd become. I doubted it. Men like Richard rarely realize when their masks have cracked. They assume the world still believes them because they've never imagined a world that doesn't. The loneliness crept in quietly, like a draft under a closed door. I found myself talking to the house more than to him. I would comment on the weather while opening the curtains, thank the kettle when it whistled, apologize to the plants when I forgot to water them. The silence had to be filled somehow. Sometimes late at night, I'd walk through the rooms in the dark, touching the furniture we had bought together decades ago, tracing my fingers along the edges as if I were reading Braille for the story of my own life. Everything still stood where it always had, yet none of it felt like mine. I had become a caretaker of a museum dedicated to a marriage that no longer existed. He noticed eventually not the sadness, but the detachment. One evening, as we were finishing dinner, he looked up from his plate and said, "You've been distant lately. Is everything all right?" I wanted to laugh. Instead, I said, "Everything's fine." He studied me for a moment, then nodded as if satisfied. He wanted compliance, not honesty. When he smiled, I saw how easy it was for him to believe me. The next day, he left for another conference, and I didn't bother pretending to care. I began to understand that the cruelty of betrayal isn't in the act itself, but in its banality. It doesn't arrive with thunder. It seeps through the cracks of ordinary life, disguised as routine. There were still groceries to buy, bills to pay, sheets to change. The world didn't pause to acknowledge my humiliation. That, perhaps, was the most humiliating thing of all. The morning after one of his absences, I went to the market and caught my reflection in the glass door of the freezer aisle. I looked tired, yes, but not broken. There was a steadiness in my posture I hadn't noticed before, a faint glint in my eyes that belonged to a woman who had begun, however quietly, to stop asking for permission to exist. He came home that evening with tulips. He had never remembered that tulips were my least favorite. He placed them in a vase, kissed my cheek, and said, "I missed you?" I nodded, smiled, thanked him, and when he turned away, I threw the flowers into the trash. They landed softly on top of yesterday's paper towels, their bright petals already beginning to bruise. I stood there for a moment, looking down at them, and felt a strange, electric calm. There was no sadness left, only precision. I understood then that his cruelty would not destroy me. It would refine me. The woman he thought he was erasing was still here, watching, remembering, and waiting for the exact moment to act. In the nights that followed, I stopped sleeping beside him. I told him the mattress hurt my back and moved to the guest room. He didn't argue, didn't ask when I might come back. Perhaps he was relieved, but for me, that small act, the refusal to share a bed, felt like the first honest decision I had made in years. The sheets smelled of laundry detergent and solitude. I slept better than I had in months. When I woke, the dawn light through the curtains looked almost new, like the start of a different story. I didn't yet know what shape it would take, only that it would be mine. The shift began without warning, like a quiet click inside me that no one else could hear. There was no single moment that I could name as the beginning, no grand declaration of independence, only a gradual loosening of something that had kept me tethered for too long. One morning, as I poured coffee into my cup, I realized I didn't know who I was talking to when I muttered the word "we." The pronoun had become a ghost, a habit of speech from a life that no longer existed. I stared at the dark liquid swirling in the cup and thought, it's only me now, and instead of fear, I felt an odd, dizzy relief. That afternoon, I walked into Richard's study not to search for evidence, but to reclaim what was mine. The room smelled faintly of him, cologne, paper, stale ambition. I ran my hand along the bookshelf, found the folder marked Finances, and opened it. Inside were bank statements, insurance policies, account numbers, all the invisible architecture of a marriage that had been built on my earnings as much as his. My name appeared on fewer and fewer pages as the years went on. Somewhere between the second mortgage and his retirement plan, I had been written out of my own life. I sat at his desk and began to make copies, not because I intended revenge, but because I needed to remember that I had existed in ink somewhere, that once upon a time I had been more than an accessory to his story. I took the copies to a small folder of my own and hid them in the lining of my suitcase in the guest room. It felt almost illicit, like a crime. Yet there was a calm pleasure in the act, the same satisfaction that comes from cleaning a wound. When I zipped the suitcase shut, I whispered to myself, mine. It wasn't a vow or a plan, just a reminder of ownership. That week, I began taking walks after breakfast. Richard assumed it was for my health, which suited me fine. I walked through neighborhoods I had never visited before, small side streets with cracked sidewalks and overgrown gardens, the kind of places where people lived lives that didn't require pretense. I liked the anonymity of it. No one there knew me as the wife of a respectable man or the woman who had once chaired charity dinners. I was just another woman in an old coat, moving through the day at her own pace. On one of those walks, I passed a second-hand bookstore, its window crowded with dusty hardcovers, and a sign that read, "Cash paid for collections." I went inside. The smell of paper and time hit me like memory. The owner, a woman with gray hair piled high in a careless bun, greeted me with the easy warmth of someone who doesn't expect anything in return. I asked if she needed help organizing her shelves. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "You good with your hands?" I told her yes. She nodded. "Come by tomorrow then. We'll see." The next day, I did. For 3 hours, I sorted through boxes of old novels, wiping dust from spines, alphabetizing names. My fingers turned gray, my back ached, and I hadn't felt that alive in years. The owner's name was Ellen, and she paid me in cash, a crisp $20 bill that I held like a relic. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was the exchange, the quiet acknowledgement that I had done something that belonged only to me. I folded the bill into my wallet and didn't tell Richard. That secrecy was its own small rebellion. At home, his routines continued unchanged. He worked, he went out, he smiled at me across the table like a man performing kindness. I had stopped confronting him because confrontation required belief, and belief was something I had run out of. Instead, I started watching, not him, but myself, measuring the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming. I bought a notebook from the bookstore and began writing again, not lists or evidence this time, but thoughts, fragments of sentences that felt like breath. "What is freedom when no one expects anything from you?" I wrote one night. "Maybe it is simply permission to be forgotten and not mind it." Sometimes I caught myself humming as I worked in the garden. The neighbors might have thought I was content, and perhaps, in a way, I was. There is a kind of peace that comes from abandoning the idea that justice will arrive. You stop waiting for apologies, explanations, closure. You simply move around the ruins, planting small seeds in the cracks. The hydrangeas began to bloom again, thick and stubborn, and I admired their defiance. They didn't need forgiveness to keep living. Neither did I. One afternoon, as I was pruning the roses, I saw Richard standing on the porch, watching me. For a moment, I thought he might come down and speak, but he only smiled faintly and said, "You look busy." His tone was easy, but there was something wary behind it, as if he sensed the quiet shift in power and didn't yet know its name. I said, "Yes, I am." Then I turned back to the roses, cutting away the dead branches with a precision that made him uncomfortable enough to retreat inside. That evening, he suggested we go out to dinner, the first time in months. I agreed, partly out of curiosity. We went to a restaurant we used to visit for anniversaries, a place with white tablecloths and soft jazz. He talked about work, about politics, about nothing. I listened, nodded, sipped my wine. At one point, he reached across the table, covered my hand with his, and said, "You know I'd never do anything to hurt you." The lie was so elegant, it almost sounded benevolent. I looked at his hand on mine, at the gold ring glinting in the candlelight, and for the first time felt nothing at all. No love, no rage, just a clear, clean emptiness. I withdrew my hand, smiled, and said, "I know." He seemed relieved by my answer, not realizing that it meant the conversation, and something larger, had ended. The next day I visited the bank. I told the clerk I needed information about an account that was in both our names. She looked up the details, printed the forms, and slid them across the counter. I signed where she indicated and closed it. Half of the balance went into a new account under my name only. I walked out of the bank into bright sunlight and felt the air move differently around me, as though the world had subtly rearranged itself to make room. That night, I made dinner for myself alone. Richard had texted that he would be late, Some work emergency, the usual script. I ate slowly, savoring the taste of independence in something as ordinary as roasted vegetables. I washed the dishes, dried them, placed them in neat stacks, and for the first time noticed how quiet the house sounded without his footsteps. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt precise, like the pause between notes in a piece of music. I poured myself a small glass of wine and sat by the window, the open notebook in my lap. I wrote. There is a version of me emerging, one who does not need to be believed to exist. Later, as I was closing the curtains, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass. The woman looking back at me was older, yes, but there was something newly alert in her expression. She looked like someone preparing for departure. I didn't yet know where I was going, only that staying had become a form of disappearance. Richard's betrayal had stripped away the story I had lived in for half a century, and beneath it, to my surprise, there was still a pulse. The realization frightened and thrilled me in equal measure. That night, I slept deeply, dreamlessly, the way people sleep when they've finally stopped negotiating with ghosts. When I woke, the morning light was soft and forgiving. I made coffee, dressed, and walked to the bookstore again. Ellen looked up as I entered, nodded toward the counter and said, "Back for more work?" I smiled and said yes. It wasn't work, really. It was a rehearsal for freedom. Every alphabetized shelf, every wiped spine was another small act of remembering myself. And as I stacked the books, I thought of all the stories inside them. Women who had left, stayed, endured, reinvented, and felt, for the first time in years, that I was one of them. It began with a letter that arrived on a Thursday afternoon, the envelope thin and unmarked except for my name written in a hurried, unfamiliar hand. I had just come back from the bookstore, my fingers still dusty from sorting through a box of old poetry volumes. I carried the mail to the kitchen table, set down my bag, and stared at it for a long time before opening it, as though my life had learned to fear envelopes. Inside was a single sheet of paper torn from a notepad, the handwriting round and hesitant. "Mrs. Whitmore," it read, "I don't know if you remember me. My name is Lila. I work at the clinic on Jefferson Street. I shouldn't be writing this, but I thought you had a right to know. He's been coming here every week with a young woman. She looks about 30. He always pays in cash. I think you deserve the truth." There was no return address, only the initials LP and a postmark from 2 towns over. I sat perfectly still for several minutes, rereading the words until they blurred. I had not expected mercy to arrive in such clumsy handwriting. The letter didn't tell me anything I didn't already know. It simply stripped away the last layer of plausible denial. I folded it carefully, slid it into the drawer where I kept my notebook, and sat in silence, listening to the refrigerator hum. The kitchen clock ticked in measured indifference, and for the first time in years, I felt time not as something happening to me, but as something I could use. I boiled water, made tea, and drank it slowly, the bitterness grounding. When Richard came home that evening, his mood was light, his voice full of that false cheerfulness that always arrived before a lie. He told me about a new client, someone he'd been helping with a complicated insurance case, how demanding she was, how young people today expected miracles. I watched him talk, marveled at the effortlessness of his deceit, the casual way he inserted fragments of the truth into his fabrications, like camouflage. I nodded, asked a polite question, even smiled. By the time he finished his story, I had already decided what I was going to do. The next morning I dressed carefully, in clothes I hadn't worn for years, a long navy coat, a silk scarf that smelled faintly of cedar from storage. I looked at myself in the mirror and thought of all the women who had been told to endure, to stay quiet for the sake of dignity, and I realized that silence had never protected anyone. It had only made betrayal easier. I took a bus to Jefferson Street, the same road I used to take when I still worked at the clinic years ago. The building was smaller than I remembered, the paint on the sign chipped, the waiting room nearly empty. I asked to see the director and told her I was there about a personal matter. She looked at me suspiciously, but didn't argue. I waited, watching the clock on the wall, and just as the minute hand reached the half-hour mark, the door opened. He walked out, holding the hand of a woman who could have been his daughter. She was visibly pregnant, her coat unbuttoned, her face pale with that mixture of exhaustion and pride that expectant mothers wear. He looked relaxed, younger somehow, as if the air around her restored him. When his eyes met mine, the color drained from his face. He froze mid-step, and for a long second none of us spoke. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't shout or cry. I simply stood up, adjusted my scarf, and said, "I was in the neighborhood." His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The young woman looked between us, confused. She asked softly, "Richard, who is this?" He hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. I turned to her and said, "I'm his wife." The girl blinked, stunned, and then her expression hardened. "He told me you were separated," she said. "He told me you were sick." I almost laughed. "That sounds like him," I replied. I left before either of them could speak again. Outside, the air was cold and bright, and for a brief moment, I felt lighter than I had in years. The clarity of humiliation, I learned, has its own kind of purity. He didn't come home that night. He didn't call either. The next morning, I found his toothbrush missing, a few shirts gone, his favorite cufflinks box empty. On the dresser lay a short note written in his usual neat handwriting. "I need time to think. Don't make this harder than it has to be." It wasn't an apology or even an admission, just another instruction disguised as civility. I tore it in half, then in half again, and threw the pieces into the sink. I didn't cry. Tears would have made him too important. Instead, I went to the bank and withdrew half of what was left in our joint savings account. When the teller asked if I wanted to close it, I said, "Not yet." I wasn't done being careful. Days turned into weeks. He called once from an unknown number, his voice calm, almost professional. He said he'd rented an apartment downtown, that he needed space to sort things out. He said the woman, Lila, so that was her name, was expecting his child, and he wanted to do right by everyone. The phrase landed like a bruise. "You can't do right by everyone," I told him. "You chose one person, and you chose wrong." He sighed, said I was being dramatic, and hung up. After that, silence. I expected anger to consume me, but what came instead was focus. I started organizing papers, updating accounts, changing locks. I spoke with a lawyer recommended by Ellen from the bookstore, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and no patience for sentimentality. She listened to my story without pity, only practicality, and when I finished, she said, "You're in a better position than most. The house is yours, the pension too, if you play it right." We spent 3 hours drafting documents, and by the end of it, I had a plan, a roadmap out of the wreckage. Walking out of her office, I realized that the fear I had lived with for months had been replaced by something steadier. Resolve. One evening, about a month after the clinic encounter, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, the young woman stood there. The same coat. Her belly rounder now. Her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She introduced herself as Lila, the real Lila, not the letter writer. She said she didn't come for forgiveness, only understanding. "He's not who I thought he was," she said. I invited her in, poured her tea. She sat at my kitchen table, looked around the room as if expecting to find traces of the man we both had known, and said, "He told me you didn't care, that you were cold." I smiled faintly. "He said the same about you, I imagine." She nodded. We sat in silence for a while, two women bound by the same lie. She told me she was keeping the baby, that she didn't expect him to stay. "He's already pulling away," she said quietly. "You can feel it, can't you? Like a draft." I nodded again. "It starts with silence," I said. When she left, she hugged me awkwardly, and I felt her shaking. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, breathing slowly. I didn't hate her. That surprised me. She was as much a casualty as I had been. Richard returned 3 days later, unannounced. He walked into the house as though nothing had changed, set his briefcase down, and called my name. I was in the living room reading. He stood in the doorway, looking older, the lines on his face deeper, the confidence dimmed. "We need to talk," he said. I marked my place in the book and looked up. "About what?" He hesitated. "About everything. About us." I gestured to the chair opposite me. "Then talk." He sat, folded his hands, and began to speak in the same careful tone he used with clients. He said he'd made mistakes, that he hadn't meant for things to go this far, that he still cared for me. He used words like rebuild, move forward, find forgiveness. I listened without interrupting until he said, "You've always been the sensible one. You'll understand." That was when I laughed, a deep, quiet laugh that startled even me. "You think this is about understanding?" I said. "It's about absence. You removed me from my own life and expected me to thank you for the space." His mouth tightened. "You're overreacting," he said. "We can fix this." I stood. "You can't fix something you've already replaced." He followed me to the kitchen, his voice rising. "I said I was sorry." I turned, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "No, you said you were inconvenienced." He left again that night, slamming the door behind him, but I knew he'd be back. Men like him always are. They circle what they think belongs to them, not out of love, but entitlement. When he returned a week later, I was ready. The divorce papers were on the table, the locks already changed, his clothes neatly packed in boxes by the door. He stood there for a long time, looking at the boxes as though they contained something sacred. "You're serious," he said finally. "Yes," I replied. "For the first time in my life." He tried to argue, to reason, to threaten. None of it landed. I had built a fortress out of indifference, and he no longer had the tools to breach it. When he finally left, he didn't look back. The days that followed were a blur of administrative precision, forms, signatures, bank visits. The lawyer handled most of it, but I insisted on being present for every step. I wanted to watch the legal dismantling of a life I had spent decades constructing. It was like surgery without anesthesia, painful but necessary. At the final meeting, when the papers were signed and the last check deposited, my lawyer handed me a copy of the decree. "It's done," she said. I looked at the pages, heavy with official language, and felt nothing at first. Then a sudden, startling weight lift from my chest. I thanked her, walked outside, and stood for a long time on the sidewalk, letting the sun warm my face. That evening, I went to the sea. It was early spring, the air sharp, the waves restless. I walked along the shore until my shoes filled with sand and the wind tangled my hair. I thought of Richard, of Lila, of the child that might already exist somewhere beyond my reach, and felt an unexpected tenderness, not for him, but for the woman I had been, the one who had believed that endurance was love. I whispered an apology to her, and then, because the ocean demanded it, I whispered forgiveness too. The tide pulled at the hem of my coat, and I let it. I stayed until the sky turned violet, until the horizon blurred into water, and when I finally turned back, I realized I wasn't walking away from something anymore. I was walking toward it. The morning it happened was ordinary in every visible way, which is perhaps why it felt almost sacred in its stillness. The sun came through the kitchen window in soft golden stripes, catching the dust motes as they drifted through the air, and I remember thinking that even silence has a texture, if you listen long enough. The night before, I had signed the final papers and placed them on the dining table beside his favorite coffee mug, the one that still bore the faint crack from when he'd dropped it years ago. I didn't sleep that night, not from anxiety, but from an almost electric awareness that the life I had known was ending in a matter of hours. I sat by the window, watching the world shift from darkness to dawn, and every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the slow exhale of wind through the trees, felt amplified, deliberate, as if the universe were holding its breath with me. When I finally rose, it was with the clarity of someone performing a ritual rather than an errand. I made coffee as I always did, measured, steady, the rhythm of habit soothing me. I laid out a simple breakfast for him: toast, butter, a slice of marmalade, though he would never eat it. Old patterns die last. On the counter, beside the divorce papers, I placed the small brass key that once opened his study, the room I had locked the night he left. Next to it, a note written in my own looping hand: "You may take what's yours." Nothing more. No signature. He would recognize the script instantly. I stood for a moment, looking at the arrangement, the papers, the key, the cup, the note, and realized it resembled an offering, or perhaps an autopsy, the remains of a union dissected and labeled with care. He arrived just after 9, punctual as always. I heard the car door slam, the crunch of gravel under his shoes, and for a fleeting second, a memory flashed. The sound of that same car pulling into the driveway 30 years earlier, our son running out to greet him, laughter echoing in the yard. The sound had once meant safety. Now it meant conclusion. He entered without knocking. He still believed he had that right. When he saw me standing by the window, he hesitated. "You're up early," he said, attempting lightness. I didn't answer. His gaze moved to the table, to the papers, the key, the note, and I watched the realization settle into him like slow poison. His voice faltered. "So this is it, then?" I nodded. "Yes, this is it." He sat down, picked up the papers, scanned them quickly. I could see his jaw tighten, the flicker of anger in his eyes. "You've made your decision," he said. "I suppose nothing I say will change your mind." I replied, "That's correct." He laughed softly, incredulously, as though he still couldn't grasp that a woman like me, quiet, dependable, domesticated, could be the one to end the story. "You're really going through with this?" he said. "After everything?" I met his gaze evenly. "After everything, yes. Because of everything." His mouth opened as if to argue, then closed again. He leaned back in the chair, exhaled sharply, and for the first time in years, he looked uncertain. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, and I almost smiled at the simplicity of the lie. "You just didn't mean to stop," I said. He stood, paced to the window, then back. "You're throwing away a lifetime," he said. "You'll regret this. You're too old to start over." The words landed with a dull thud, familiar weapons from an old arsenal, but they no longer pierced. "I'm not starting over," I said. "I'm continuing without you." Something in my tone, calm, unflinching, unnerved him. He stared at me for a long moment, as though searching for the woman he thought he could control, the one who would break under the weight of his disappointment. But she was gone, replaced by someone whose silence was no longer submission, but authority. He finally signed the papers, the pen scratching across the paper like the sound of something being cut loose. When he was done, he looked at me and said, "You think this will make you happy?" I replied, "It will make me free. Happiness is none of your concern." He gathered his coat, his briefcase, moved toward the door, then paused. "What about the house?" he asked, his tone clipped, practical. "It's mine," I said. "It always was. You just lived here." For a second, he looked as if he might protest, but something in my expression stopped him. He nodded, turned, and left. The door closed behind him with the softest click, and in that sound, I heard the final breath of our marriage. For a long time, I didn't move. The quiet felt immense, almost physical, pressing against my ears until I realized it wasn't silence at all, but the sound of absence filling space. I walked through the house slowly, room by room, touching the surfaces he'd once claimed, opening drawers that now belonged solely to me. In his study, I found the photograph of us from our 10th anniversary, framed on the desk. I picked it up, studied the image. 2 smiling faces, strangers wrapped in the illusion of forever, and felt nothing but mild curiosity. I set it down, turned the frame to face the wall. Then I opened the window wide and let the morning air sweep through, cold and cleansing. Papers rustled. Curtains shifted. The house exhaled. I spent the rest of the day clearing, sorting, shedding. I filled bags with clothes he had left behind, books he'd never read, mementos of a life that no longer needed preservation. Each item removed a little more weight from the air. By afternoon, the house felt larger, echoing, not empty, but expectant. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch, watching the light change on the trees. A few neighbors passed by and waved. I waved back, smiling, a gesture so ordinary it felt revolutionary. Freedom, I realized, does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives disguised as the simple act of staying still without permission. That evening, I took a small wooden box from the drawer of my bedside table, the one where I had hidden the notebook, the letter from the clinic, the fragments of evidence I had once believed I'd need to justify leaving. I carried it outside to the garden, to the patch beneath the hydrangeas that had outlived every season. I dug a shallow hole, placed the box inside, and covered it with soil. The earth was cool and damp against my hands. When I finished, I sat back on my heels and whispered, "It's over." It wasn't a curse or a lament, just a statement of fact. The wind moved through the branches as if in response. Inside, I changed into a clean nightgown, opened the window, and lay down on the bed that finally felt like mine. For a moment, I expected sadness to come, but it didn't. What came instead was a stillness so deep it felt ancestral, as though generations of women who had stayed too long were breathing with me, through me, witnessing my exit from a lineage of endurance. I thought of my mother, who once told me that a woman's worth is measured by what she can bear. I wished I could tell her she was wrong. A woman's worth, I now knew, is measured by the moment she decides to stop bearing. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized I was no longer haunted by the images that had once consumed me. The test, the clinic, the other woman's face. They were still there, but distant, like old photographs stored in an attic. I had not forgiven him. I had simply removed the need to. Forgiveness, I understood, was a privilege he hadn't earned. What I felt instead was release, pure and precise, like the click of a lock finally opening. When I woke the next morning, sunlight filled the room, gentle and unapologetic. I made coffee, poured it into my favorite mug, the one he never liked because it was chipped, and carried it to the garden. The hydrangeas glowed pale blue in the morning light. I sat on the bench, breathed deeply, and listened to the birdsong threading through the air. For the first time in half a century, I was no one's wife, no one's caretaker, no one's explanation. I was simply a woman sitting in her own quiet, and it was enough. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so gentle it almost frightened me. After years of living inside noise, the clatter of obligation, the constant background hum of someone else's presence, the quiet felt both vast and intimate, like a room I hadn't entered in decades, but that somehow still remembered my footsteps. I woke early each morning, not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel the morning unfold. The first light spilled across the walls of my bedroom like warm water, and I would lie there for a few minutes, watching how it touched everything, how it asked nothing of me. I had never realized that peace could feel so physical, that it could inhabit the body like a second heartbeat. On the second week of this new life, I bought a small notebook and wrote one sentence on the first page. I am no longer waiting for anyone to return. It wasn't a declaration of bitterness, but of fact. The waiting had been the heaviest part, the invisible labor of believing that love would someday rearrange itself into decency. Once that belief died, everything else began to bloom. I kept going to the bookstore 3 times a week. Ellen had given me a permanent key after she decided she wanted to travel more, and I found myself alone there often, surrounded by the soft chaos of stories. I liked the smell of the old paper, the way the dust floated through the shafts of sunlight, the sense that every spine held a pulse. Sometimes people came in and mistook me for the owner, and I didn't correct them. I liked being thought of as someone who belonged to the world of words, not the world of disappointments. When I shelved books, I often imagined the lives of the people who had owned them before, their hands turning pages, their eyes searching for something unnamed. And I realized that most of us spend our lives trying to find sentences that mirror the ones we cannot speak aloud. In that quiet shop, I found mine. One afternoon, a young woman came in, maybe 30, her hair tied back, her face drawn with the exhaustion of new motherhood. She carried a stroller, and inside was a sleeping baby, its tiny fists curled against its chest. She wandered for a while, running her fingers along the shelves, and then stopped at the counter. "Do you have anything about starting over?" she asked. The question struck me like a soft echo, and I handed her a copy of a book I had always loved, something about women who build new lives from ashes. She smiled faintly, thanked me, and as she was leaving, I realized I knew her face. It was Lila. She didn't recognize me at first. When she did, she froze. her expression caught between shame and relief. I nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and said, "You look well." She whispered, "I'm trying." And I said, "That's enough." She left without another word, but the air she left behind felt lighter. As I watched her push the stroller down the street, I felt no resentment, no bitterness, only a quiet kinship. We were both survivors of the same delusion, both learning how to breathe in new air. That evening, after closing the shop, I walked to the shore. The sea had become a kind of confession booth for me, a place where words could be spoken without needing to be answered. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of salt and distance. I sat on a bench facing the horizon, the same one I had chosen months ago when everything was still raw. The tide moved in long, patient breaths, erasing footprints almost as soon as they were made. I thought of Richard then, not with longing, but with a curious tenderness for the version of him that had once tried, however imperfectly, to love me. Perhaps he had loved me as much as he was able, and perhaps that was the tragedy, that sometimes love's capacity is smaller than the life it enters. I didn't forgive him, but I no longer needed to define myself against him either. He had become like a season that had simply passed. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice the return of small joys, the way a ripe peach yielded under my fingers, the warmth of tea on my tongue, the satisfaction of sweeping dust from the porch. I planted herbs in the garden again, filled the kitchen with their scent. When I walked through town, people greeted me by name. Some still asked politely about him, and I would say only that he was elsewhere, which was true enough. No one pressed further. Perhaps they sensed that some stories are complete even when they end quietly. At night, I read until my eyes blurred, sometimes aloud, so the sound of my own voice wouldn't fade from my life. I had spent decades speaking in tones meant to soothe someone else. Now I was learning to hear myself. One morning, Ellen sent a postcard from Italy. On the back, she had written, "Freedom looks good on you. Keep it." I pinned it to the refrigerator door and smiled each time I saw it. Freedom did not feel dramatic or loud. It felt like the ability to decide how the day would unfold and to know that no one else's mood would determine its course. It felt like sleeping through the night without listening for another person's breathing. It felt like cooking a single meal and savoring it without apology. It felt like walking home in the rain and not caring if I got wet. As autumn arrived, the hydrangeas began to pale, their petals drying into delicate paper shells. I left them as they were, beautiful even in decay. Sometimes I would sit by them with my journal and write letters I would never send, to my younger self, to my mother, to all the women I had met who mistook endurance for devotion. I wrote to them, "You are not weak for wanting peace. You are not foolish for having believed. You are not ruined because someone failed to see you." I imagined them reading those words, nodding, perhaps weeping, and it comforted me to think that our pain might speak the same language. On my 73rd birthday, I invited no one. I baked a small cake, lit a single candle, and ate it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I didn't make a wish because wishes belong to the uncertain, and I no longer was. Instead, I whispered, "Thank you." Not to any god or ghost, but to the stubborn, quiet part of me that had carried me through the wreckage. The air outside was cool, the garden alive with crickets, and I felt, for the first time in my long life, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Now, sometimes, when I see an older woman sitting alone in a cafe, staring out the window with that mix of weariness and wonder. I want to tell her what I've learned. That solitude is not a sentence but a shelter. That it's never too late to return to yourself. I want to tell her that she will wake one morning and realize the world still wants her in it. That her story isn't over simply because someone else stopped reading. And though I never speak to them, I send those words silently into the air, like prayers for strangers. If you are reading this and you think it's too late, if you believe the years have hardened you beyond redemption, I promise you they haven't. There is always a small, defiant pulse waiting beneath the quiet, asking only to be heard. I found mine at 72, in the ruins of a life I thought was finished. It was small at first, like the flicker of a match, but it was enough to light the rest of my days. And now, when I walk to the sea each evening and watch the horizon blur into the sky, I whisper to the woman I once was, the one who waited too long. We made it home.